Okay, real talk to start off. You clocked out, you sat in your car, and you cried. Not because anything actually went wrong, because you made it through the whole shift without anyone finding out you don't really know what you're doing. Sound familiar? If that's you right now, stay with me because we're talking about imposter syndrome today. And I want to tell you exactly why that feeling is not evidence against you. It's actually the opposite. Hey, welcome back to Nursing Matters, the podcast where we talk career, confidence, and the stuff nobody actually covers in orientation. I'm Christina, founder of the RN Network, and I've spent over 20 years in healthcare talent acquisition, which means I've watched thousands of nurses walk this exact road. So today's episode is for new grads. And honestly, well, it's for every nurse who has ever felt like a fraud in scrubs, no matter how many years you've been in. Now, before we dig into the coaching part, let's talk trends for a second. Nursing programs nationally are cranking out record numbers of new grads to fill the gap left by retiring baby boomer nurses. But here's the thing. Hospitals keep reporting that first-year turnover is still one of the biggest cost drivers. Why? Preceptor shortages, compressed orientation timelines, units stretched way too thin. That's the environment you're walking into, not a reflection of your confidence, okay? Now, the good news. Facilities are investing more in structured residency programs and mentorship pairings because they finally connected the dots. Nurses who feel supported in year 1 actually stick around for year 5. If your unit doesn't have that yet, that's a systems problem, not a you problem. Hold on to that because we're about to use it. And here's something I want to add because it matters for how you interpret everything else today. This isn't a new phenomenon that's uniquely happening to your generation. Every single cohort of new grads in the history of this profession has gone through some version of this exact fog. What's changed is that we're finally talking about it openly instead of pretending it doesn't exist, which, honestly, I think is a good thing for all of you. Let me tell you about a nurse I'll call Jen because I've coached probably a dozen versions of her over the years. Jen was 4 months into her first ICU job, and she called me absolutely convinced she was going to get fired any day. Not because anyone had said anything critical to her, her manager actually loved her, but because she still had to look things up constantly. And in her head, that meant she wasn't up for this. Here's what she couldn't see because she was standing too close to it all. Looking things up correctly, even under pressure, in a genuinely high-stakes moment, is the actual skill. 6 months earlier, she wouldn't have even known what to look up in the first place. That's the part that's invisible to you when you're inside of this. The progress you can't see because you're the one living inside it every single day, shift after shift, without a clear before and after photo to compare yourself to. I asked Jen to do one simple thing. Every night before bed for 2 weeks, just text me one sentence about something she did that day that she couldn't have done 6 months prior. By day 10, she stopped needing to send them to me because she started noticing them about herself in real time on the unit. That's really the whole game with imposter syndrome. You're not actually incompetent. You just don't have a system for noticing your own competence yet. We're going to build you one right now. What struck me most about Jen's story looking back is how quickly the shift happened once she had a structure for it. It wasn't months of therapy or some dramatic breakthrough. It was 2 weeks of a tiny, consistent habit that retrained her attention towards evidence instead of fear. That's actually how this actually resolves. Not through one big insight, but through small, repeated proof stacked up until the old story just can't hold anymore. So let's actually define what we're dealing with here. Imposter syndrome is that persistent feeling that your success is basically an accident, that you're about to be found out, and that everyone around you has it more figured out than you do. And it's incredibly common in nursing because your whole training process teaches you to be hyper vigilant about mistakes, which it's a great instinct at the bedside, terrible internal narrator in your own head. So the first reframe I want you to take with you: confidence and competence do not show up in the same day. Confidence is always a few steps behind competence, always. That gap is normal. It is not a warning sign that you're in over your head. Every nurse you admire, every charge nurse who seems like she was just born knowing how to run a code, she felt exactly like you feel right now at some point. The only difference is she didn't quit in that gap. So here's reframe number 2, and I really want this one to land. Being scared of missing something means your clinical judgment is actually engaged. Honestly, the new nurse I'd worry about is the one who feels zero uncertainty in year 1. That fear that you're carrying at your stage, that's just data collection. Your brain is correctly flagging that you're still building pattern recognition, and that takes repetition. Usually somewhere between 12 and 18 months of full patient assignments before things start clicking into instinct instead of feeling like memorized steps. There's also a reframe I want to give you around comparison, because I think it does more damage than almost anything else at this stage. You are constantly comparing your behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. The charge nurse who looks completely unbothered during a code, you have no idea what her first year actually looked like. And I promise you, if you asked her, she'd tell you stories that would probably surprise you. Comparison at this stage is just measuring your rough draft against someone else's final print. And that's not a fair fight for anyone. Okay, so what do you actually do with that feeling instead of just white knuckling through it? First thing, start what I call a proof file. At the end of every shift, write down one thing you did competently. Caught a subtle vital sign trend, calmed down a terrified family member, prioritized your assignment correctly under pressure. Those are items for your proof file. You're building evidence against the fraud narrative, and your brain needs to see it in writing because emotions don't respond to logic. They respond to repetition. Second thing, start separating I don't know from I can't find out. Think about that. New nurses treat not knowing something in the moment like it's proof they're not cut out for this work. And it's not. The actual skill isn't knowing everything. It's knowing how to get the information and answer fast. Asking your resource nurse, pulling the policy, calling the pharmacist. So reframe every single I don't know into I found out. That's the competency actually being tested here. Third, go to find one person on your unit who will tell you the truth and not just reassure you. That's great, but you need more. You need someone who will actually tell you when you nailed something and be very honest when you didn't. Vague reassurance doesn't fix imposter syndrome. Specific, honest feedback does, because it replaces the guessing game in your head with real information. Fourth, and this one's a little uncomfortable, but I think it's important. Pay attention to who you're seeking that reassurance from and how often. If you find yourself needing constant validation just to get through a shift, that's worth naming out loud to yourself, not because it's shameful, but because the goal is to eventually build that internal sense of competence, so it isn't dependent on someone else confirming it for you every single day. Fifth, watch your self-talk language, specifically during the actual moment of doubt, not just afterward in reflection. If your internal voice during a hard moment says, "I can't do this," try physically changing it, even out loud under your breath, to, "This is hard and I'm figuring it out." That's not just positive thinking for its own sake. It's accurate. You genuinely are figuring it out in real time, and the language you use shapes how much panic versus focus you bring to that moment. Sixth, and this one matters more than people expect, get enough sleep and food during your work stretches. I know that sounds unrelated to a psychological pattern like imposter syndrome, but a depleted, exhausted nervous system amplifies self-doubt dramatically. Half the spiral moments new nurses describe to me happen on minimal sleep and a skipped meal, not because the clinical situation was actually that dire. There's one more layer worth adding here about how imposter syndrome interacts with feedback specifically. A lot of new nurses hear one piece of corrective feedback in a shift full of things they did well, and their brain files that single correction as proof of the whole fraud narrative, while completely discounting everything else that went right. Watch for that pattern in yourself. One correction in an otherwise solid shift is normal supervision, not a referendum on your competence, and treating it as such, it's just exactly the kind of distorted math that keeps the fraud story alive far longer than it should. I also want to name something practical about how this shows up physically, not just mentally. A lot of new nurses describe a very specific bodily sensation right before a hard task. It may be a tightening chest, a racing heart, sweaty palms, and they interpret that as proof they're not cut out for this work. That physical activation is just your nervous system preparing you to perform under pressure. Elite performers in every high-stakes field, whether it's surgeons, pilots, athletes, they all report the exact same physical sensations before high-stakes moments. The sensation isn't the problem. It's the story you tell yourself about what that sensation means that is. And you get to choose a different story. And last thing, give yourself an actual timeline. Most new nurses tell me the fog starts lifting somewhere around month 9 to 12, and by 18 months, they genuinely can't believe how far they've come. That's not a coincidence. That's just the normal curve. You are exactly where you're supposed to be, even if it doesn't quite feel like it today. So let's talk about some common mistakes to avoid. Mistake number 1 is trying to hide your uncertainty instead of voicing it. New nurses often think admitting "I'm not sure" in front of a preceptor or charge nurse makes them look weak, and it's actually the opposite. Experienced nurses trust the person who says, "Let me double check that," far more than the one who guesses confidently and gets it wrong. Mistake number 2, comparing your year 1 self to someone else's year 5 self and treating it like that's a fair benchmark. We touched on this already, but it's worth naming as its own specific trap because it's probably the single most common comparison error new nurses make over and over without realizing they're doing it. Mistake number 3, going completely silent about the struggle, even with people who genuinely want to help. Isolation makes imposter syndrome so much worse because your brain fills the silence with worst-case assumptions about what everyone else is thinking. Nearly every new grad I've ever coached felt some relief the moment they said the fear out loud to literally anyone, even before getting any advice back. So, listener mailbag. Got a message this week from a listener who asked, what if I still feel like this even at 3 years in? Does that mean something's actually wrong? It's a great question, and the honest answer is it depends what quotation marks this means. A lingering hum of self-doubt before a hard shift, it's totally normal. Even veteran nurses carry some version of that forever. But if at 3 years you're still feeling the acute, paralyzing version we're describing today, that's usually a sign of something more specific. Maybe a unit culture that's never given you honest feedback, or maybe some anxiety that's bigger than just this job and deserves its own attention with a professional. Both are fixable. Neither means you're failing at nursing. Another listener asked, does imposter syndrome ever come back after it goes away the first time? Actually, yes. And honestly, that's worth knowing up front so it doesn't blindside you. It tends to resurface at transition points. A new unit, a new specialty, becoming charged for the first time, precepting for the first time. The good news is once you've built the tools we've talked about today, the second and third time it shows up, you'll recognize it faster and move through it quicker because you'll already know it's just a phase, not a verdict. All right, quick word from the RN Network. If you're a new grad trying to figure out what you're actually worth on paper, not just emotionally, but financially, go check out our salary database at rnnet.org. It's broken down by state, specialty, and experience level, built from real reported data across over 200,000 plus members community. So you can walk into your first performance review or your next offer conversation with real numbers instead of a guess. It's free to search, and it's one of the most used tools on the whole site for exactly this reason. Visit rnnet.org. So here's your homework before the next episode, and I want you to actually do all 3 parts. 1, today, write down one thing from today's shift you handled competently. Just 1. 2, do it again tomorrow, and then the day after that. Every single shift for the next 30 days. 3, at the end of those 30 days, sit down and actually read back through the entire list in one sitting. That third step matters more than people expect because reading 30 entries back to back hits differently than writing one at a time. You'll have 30 pieces of evidence that the fraud story in your head has been lying to you this whole time. And that's it for today's episode. If this message resonated with you, please be sure to like and subscribe wherever you stream your favorite content. If you know a nurse who may be suffering from imposter syndrome, please share this episode with them. As always, I appreciate you listening today, and remember, keep going because nursing matters. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Nursing Matters Daily Dose. Are you interested in more career resources? Then hop on over to the RN Network at rnnet.org. Also, while you're at it, hit that like and subscribe button and share this episode with one nurse who really needs to hear it. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.